Psalm 118. His steadfast love endures forever. O give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Let Israel say, his steadfast love endures forever. Let the house of Aaron say, his steadfast love endures forever. Let those who fear the Lord say, his steadfast love endures forever. Out of my distress I called on the Lord. The Lord answered me and set me free. The Lord is on my side. I will not fear. What can man do to me? The Lord is on my side as my helper. I shall look in triumph on those who hate me. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in man. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in princes. All the nations surround me. In the name of the Lord I cut them off. They surrounded me on every side. In the name of the Lord I cut them off. They surrounded me like bees. They went out like a fire among the thorns. In the name of the Lord I cut them off. I was pushed hard so that I was falling, but the Lord helped me. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. Glad songs of salvation are in the tents of the righteous. The right hand of the Lord does valiantly. The right hand of the Lord exalts. The right hand of the Lord does valiantly. I shall not die, but I shall live, and recount the deeds of the Lord. The Lord has disciplined me severely, but he has not given me over to death. Open to me the gates of righteousness, that I may enter through them, and give thanks to the Lord. This is the gate of the Lord. The righteous shall enter through it. I thank you that you have answered me, and you have become my salvation. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Save us, we pray, O Lord. O Lord, we pray, give us success. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. We bless you from the house of the Lord. The Lord is God, and he has made his light shine upon us. Bind the festal sacrifice with cords up to the horns of the altar. You are my God, and I will give thanks to you. You are my God, I will extol you. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. So what can be said of this psalm? In some sense, it's a fairly straightforward one, especially considering the depth of Psalm 116. But there's still much here, depending on how detailed we want to be. But certainly verses 5 through 9 deserve further comment. Out of my distress I called on the Lord, and the Lord answered me and set me free. The Lord is on my side. I will not fear. What can man do to me? The Lord is on my side as my helper. I shall look in triumph on those who hate me. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in man. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in princes. And so here we see a very condensed version of Psalm 116 in verse 5. Out of my distress I called on the Lord, The Lord answered me and set me free. Whereas this distress may be the descent into the pit of Sheol, into the darkness, into the nothingness, the void, and this calling upon the Lord is true liberation. Not only is it liberation for man, but it is liberation for the individual, the author of this psalm. And so now he is set free. He has found God. He has found a way to walk. And so what can man do to him? How can man hereafter rule over him? How can this person submit to the arbitrary objectives of the designs of another that are inherently inferior to the designs of God? Certainly he must submit. Even among man, there is temptation to submit. And should it not be the case that given a cause worthy enough, he should submit to a man that is of a particular quality, a particular caliber of leadership, with a particular strength of vision that is in line with God? Perhaps. But it should always and forevermore be his choice. By his will alone is he allowed to make this decision. And if it is the case that the only decision that he can make is among the saturated farmlands, the once fertile farmlands, now saturated with a high concentration of salt that prevents the further flourishing of individual crops, and all that is left are but a few plots to plant on, a few individuals to submit to, without the possibility of growing one's own plant, to plant one's own seed. And in this environment, this ever reduction in abundance, those that have planted their seed, that choose to lead the others that have not, begin to pervert their incentives, their drives become perverse. And what now of this condition of man? The man that came from his distress, that he was liberated when he called upon the Lord. What can man do to him now? What does it mean for him in this condition? Because in a sense, the designs of man have placed a roof over him, have placed walls around him, have provided him with security and safety in exchange for his slavery. What of these bonds? When he remembers it is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in man. What of these bonds when he remembers it is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in princes? All of them these people of authority, the nations that have surrounded me. In the name of the Lord, I've cut them off. They surrounded me on every side, and in the name of the Lord, I cut them off. They surrounded me like bees. They went out like a fire among thorns. In the name of the Lord, I cut them off. And so now what? What to do in this environment? I was pushed hard so that I was falling, but the Lord helped me. And so you see, this faith is not a simple thing, especially given the multitude of potential scenarios that we can plug into our hypothetical that we have just described. How do we deal with restrictive environments? What do we do when we are confronted by this falling? Are we to remain faithful to being set free? Or are we to succumb to our base desires and choose security, not knowing that in time this very security that we choose will make us worse off than we were to begin with? If it is not us, then certainly it will be our children that suffer this fate. I shall not die, but I shall live, and recount the deeds of the Lord. The Lord has disciplined me severely, but he has not given me over to death. And this is what it takes. If one finds themselves in such a position, if a society finds itself in such a position, they will be disciplined severely. It's possible that they will die. But we have to hope that we will not be given over to death, that our children may survive. Open to me the gates of righteousness, that I may enter through them, and give thanks to the Lord. This is the gate of the Lord. The righteous shall enter through it. I thank you that you have answered me, and you have become my salvation. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And this is the fundamental piece of what we've been talking about. Not only the appeal to God to have the gates of righteousness open to us, but the recognition that the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The very thing that has led to this perversion and the subjection of man to the perverse desires of other men is this very condition. These builders, the subjectors, have rejected the cornerstone. And in so doing, they have lowered themselves beneath their capacity as men. Or perhaps I should say they have attempted to elevate themselves higher than the divine nature allows. And so their cornerstone fails them, their fundament, the ground in which they plant their seeds, eventually becomes infertile. And so the stone that the builders reject has become the cornerstone. And it is up to us to find that cornerstone and become the new builders. This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Save us, we pray, O Lord. O Lord, we pray, give us success. The Lord is God, and he has made his light to shine upon us. Bind the festal sacrifice with cords up to the horns of the altar. And here we see this everlasting devotion, the all-out devotion, the willingness to sacrifice all that he has at the altar, to give it up to God, to offer up the heart, to offer up the mind to God, and to trust in him, to lead us in the right direction. You are my God, and I will give thanks to you. You are my God, I will extol you. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. I find it often difficult when I am continually pulled into a direction that I know will not benefit me long term. I know that it will alleviate my immediate suffering. And I also understand that it will have a consequence to it. Whether it be from wasted time or to harm of the body or of the mind. These sorts of temptations and these vices, they're a troubling species. And how is it that we can truly convince the mind that these species, these misplaced goods, the desire for immediate satisfaction, for the tempering of our drive for existence, all of the modern comforts the internet has provided us, not only the internet, but this massive advanced global civilization that we seem to be living in, this time of profound material prosperity. How is the human being meant to survive this temptation and this pull away from God? And certainly, we've been engaging in the answer thus far. And part of the answer is by truly to engage with that part of us that tempts us, that attempts to draw us away, so that we may effectively combat it. Psalm 119. Your word is a lamp to my feet. Aleph. Blessed are those whose way is blameless, who walk in the law of the Lord. Blessed are those who keep his testimonies, who seek him with their whole heart, who also do nothing wrong, but walk in his ways. You have commanded your precepts to be kept diligently. Oh, that my ways may be steadfast in keeping your statutes. Then I shall not be put to shame, having my eyes fixed on all your commandments. I will praise you with an upright heart. I will learn your righteous rules. I will keep your statutes. Do not utterly forsake me. Beth. How can a young man keep his way pure? By guarding it according to your word. With my whole heart I seek you. Let not me wander from your commandments. I have stored up your word in my heart, that I might not sin against you. Blessed are you, O Lord. Teach me your statutes. With my lips I declare all the rules of your mouth. In the way of your testimonies I delight, as much as in all riches. I will meditate on your precepts, and fix my eyes on your ways. I will delight in your statutes. I will not forget your word. Deal bountifully with your servant, that I may live and keep your word. Open my eyes, that I may behold wondrous things of your law. I am a sojourner on the earth. Hide not your commandments from me. My soul is consumed with longing for your rules at all times. You rebuke the insolent, accursed ones, who wander from your commandments. Take away from me scorn and contempt, for I have kept your testimonies. Even though princes sit plotting against me, your servant will meditate on your statutes. Your testimonies are my delight. They are my counselors. Deleth. My soul clings to the dust. Give me life according to your word. When I told of my ways, you answered me. Teach me your statutes. Make me understand the way of your precepts, and I will meditate your wondrous works. My soul melts away for sorrow, strengthening me according to your word. Put false ways far from me, and graciously teach me your law. I have chosen the way of the faithfulness. I set your rules before me. I cling to your testimonies, O Lord. Let me not be put to shame. I will run in the way of your commandments. When you enlarge my heart, teach me, O Lord, the way of your statutes, and I will keep it to the end. Give me understanding that I may keep your law and observe it with my whole heart. Lead me in the path of your commandments, for I delight in it. Incline your heart to your testimonies, and not to selfish gain. Turn my eyes from looking at worthless things, and give me life in your ways. Confirm to your servant your promise, that you may be feared. Turn away the reproach that I dread, for your rules are good. Behold, I long for your precepts, and your righteousness give me life. Wah. Let your steadfast love come to me, O Lord, your salvation according to your promise. Then I shall have an answer for him who taunts me, for I trust in your word. And take not the word of truth utterly out of my mouth, for my hope is in your rules. I will keep your law continually, forever and ever. And I shall walk in a wide place, for I have sought your precepts. I will also speak of your testimonies before kings, and shall not be put to shame, for I find my delight in your commandments, which I love. I will lift up my hands towards your commandments, which I love, and I will meditate on your statutes. Zayin. Remember your word to your servant, in which you have made me hope. This is my comfort in my affliction, that your promise gives me life. The insolent utterly deride me, but I do not turn away from your law. When I think of your rules, From of old I take comfort, O Lord. Hot indignation seizes me because of the wicked, who forsake your law. Your statutes have been my songs in the house of my sojourning. I remember your name in the night, O Lord, and keep your law. This blessing has fallen to me, that I have kept your precepts. Heth. The Lord is my portion. I promise to keep your words. I entreat your favor with all my heart. Be gracious to me according to your promise. When I think on my ways, I turn my feet to your testimonies. I hasten and do not delay to keep your commandments. Though the cords of the wicked ensnare me, I do not forget your law. At midnight I rise to praise you, because of your righteous rules. I am a companion of all who fear you, of those who keep your precepts. The earth, O Lord, is full of your steadfast love. Teach me your statutes. Teth. You have dealt with your servant. You have dealt well with your servant, O Lord, according to your word. Teach me good judgment and knowledge, for I believe in your commandments. Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I keep your word. You are good and do good. Teach me your statutes. The insolent smear me with lies, but with my whole heart I keep your precepts. Their heart is unfeeling like fat, but I delight in your law. It is good for me that I was afflicted, that I might learn your statutes. The law of your mouth is better to me than thousands of gold and silver pieces. Yod. Your hand hath made me and fashioned me. Give me understanding that I may learn your commandments. Those who fear you shall see me and rejoice, because I have hoped in your word. I know, O Lord, that your rules are righteous, and that in faithfulness you have afflicted me. Let your steadfast love comfort me, according to your promise to your servant. Let your mercy come to me, that I may live, for your law is my delight. Let the insolent be put to shame, because they have wronged me with falsehood. As for me, I will meditate on your precepts. Let those who fear you turn to me, that they may know your testimonies. May my heart be blameless in your statutes, that I may not be put to shame. Keph. My soul longs for your salvation. I hope in your word. My eyes long for your promise. I ask, when will you comfort me? For I have become like a wineskin in the smoke. Yet I have not forgotten your statutes. How long must your servant endure? When will you judge those who persecute me? The insolent have dug pitfalls for me. They do not live according to your law. All your commandments are sure. They persecute me with falsehood. Help me. They have almost made an end of me on earth, but I have not forsaken your precepts. In your steadfast love, give me life, that I may keep the testimonies of your mouth. Lambda. Forever, O Lord, your word is firmly fixed in the heavens. Your faithfulness endures to all generations. You have established the earth, and it stands fast. By your appointment, they stand this day. For all things are your servants. If your law had not been my delight, I would have perished in my affliction. I will never forget your precepts, for by them you have given me life. I am yours. Save me. For I have sought your precepts. The wicked lie in wait to destroy me, but I consider your testimonies. I have seen a limit to all perfection, but your commandment is exceedingly broad. Mem. Oh, how I love your law. It is my meditation all the day. Your commandment makes me wiser than my enemies, for it is ever with me. I have more understanding than all my teachers, for your testimonies are my meditation. I understand more than the aged, for I keep your precepts. I hold back my feet from every evil way in order to keep your word. I do not turn aside from your rules, for they have taught me. How sweet are your words to my taste, sweeter than honey to my mouth. Through your precepts I get understanding. Therefore I hate every false way. None. Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. I have sworn an oath and confirmed it, to keep your righteous rules. I am severely afflicted. Give me life, O Lord, according to your word. Accept my free will offering of praise, O Lord, and teach me your rules. I hold my life in my hand continually, but I do not forget your law. The wicked have laid a snare for me, but I do not stray from your precepts. Your testimonies are my heritage forever, for they are the joy of my heart. I incline my heart to perform your statutes forever, to the end. Simek. I hate the double-minded, but I love your law. You are my hiding place and my shield. I hope in your word. Depart from me, you evildoers, that I may keep the commandments of my God. Uphold me according to your promise, that I may live. And let me not be put to shame in my hope. Hold me up, that I may be safe, and have regard for your statutes continually. You spurn all who go astray from your statutes, for their cunning is in vain. All the wicked of the earth you discard like dross. Therefore I love your testimonies. My flesh trembles for fear of you, and I am afraid of your judgments. Ayin, I have done what is just and right. Do not leave me to my oppressors. Give your servant a pledge of good. Let not the insolent oppress me. My eyes long for your salvation, and for the fulfillment of your righteous promise. Deal with your servant according to your steadfast love, and teach me your statutes. I am your servant, give me understanding, that I may know your testimonies. It is time for the Lord to act, for your law has been broken. Therefore I love your commandments above gold, above fine gold. Therefore I consider all your precepts to be right. I hate every false way. Peh. Your testimonies are wonderful, therefore my soul keeps them. The unfolding of your words gives light. It imparts understanding to the simple. I open my mouth and pant, because I long for your commandments. Turn to me and be gracious to me. As is your way with those who love your name, keep steady my steps according to your promise, and let no iniquity get dominion over me. Redeem me from man's oppression, that I may keep your precepts. Make your face shine upon your servant, and teach me your statutes. My eyes shed streams of tears, because people do not know your law. Tasade. Righteous are you, O Lord, and right are your rules. You have appointed your testimonies in righteousness, and in all faithfulness. My zeal consumes me, because my foes forget your words. Your promise is well tried, and your servant loves it. I am small and despised, yet I do not forget your precepts. Your righteousness is righteous forever, and your law is true. Trouble and anguish have found me out, but your commandments are my delight. Your testimonies are righteous forever. Give me understanding that I may live. Cough. With my whole heart I cry, answer me, O Lord. I will keep your statutes. I call to you, save me, that I may observe your testimonies. I rise before the dawn and cry for help. I hope in your words. My eyes are awake before the watches of the night, that I may meditate on your promise. Hear my voice according to your steadfast love. O Lord, according to your justice, give me life. They draw near who persecute me with evil purpose. They are far from your law, but you are near, O Lord, and all your commandments are true. Long have I known from your testimonies that you have founded them forever. Resh, look at my affliction and deliver me, for I do not forget your law. Plead my cause and redeem me. Give me life according to your promise. Salvation is far from the wicked, for they do not seek your statutes. Great is your mercy, O Lord. Give me life according to your rules. Many are my persecutors and my adversaries, but I do not swerve from your testimonies. I look at the faithless with disgust, because they do not keep your commands. Consider how I love your precepts. Give me life according to your steadfast love. The sum of your word is truth, and every one of your righteous rules endures forever. Sin and Shin. Princes persecute me without cause, but my heart stands in awe of your words. I rejoice at your word, like one who finds great spoil. I hate and abhor falsehood, but I love your law. 7 times a day I praise you for your righteous rules. Great peace have those who love your law. Nothing can make them stumble. I hope for your salvation, O Lord, and I do your commandments. My soul keeps your testimonies. I love them exceedingly. I keep your precepts and testimonies, for all my ways are before you. Ta. Let my cry come before you, O Lord. Give me understanding according to your words. Let my plea come before you. Deliver me according to your word. My lips will pour forth praise. For you teach me your statutes. My tongue will sing of your word. For all your commandments are right. Let your hand be ready to help me, for I have chosen your precepts. I long for your salvation, O Lord, and your law is my delight. Let my soul live and praise you, and let your rules help me. I have gone astray like a lost sheep. Seek your servant, for I do not forget your commandments. Now, before we get into this in any particular detail, I'd like to state the 10 Commandments here so we have them on the top of our minds. Number 1, you shall have no other gods before me. 2, you shall not make for yourself an idol. 3, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. 4, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 5, honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. That was number 6. Number 7, you shall not commit adultery. 8, you shall not steal. 9, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. 10, you shall not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. Now, with that said, let's get into the psalm, probably the longest psalm, certainly the longest psalm that we have read thus far. First impression is that this is fairly straightforward as far as psalms go. Certainly sounds like David is the author of this. A person that's afflicted by multiple enemies that surround him. A person that keeps his steadfast faith despite the the conditions that he finds himself in. Now, right out from verse 1, I think there's something that we can say about this. Blessed are those whose way is blameless, who walk in the law of the Lord. Now, when I read that, the first thing I thought of was the movie Forrest Gump. Now, here's the case where we have an individual whose IQ may not be the highest. It's in the movie, it's referenced as being below average, or below the standard. Below the standard for even being admitted into a normal school. However, throughout his life he demonstrated discipline, and through his simplistic nature and in his innocence, he kept the commandments of God, and as such he became Christ-like, despite his cognitive limitations compared to the rest. And that's sort of what makes this it made it a great movie. And so when I see blessed are those whose way is blameless, I think of this character. His way is blameless, and that's what makes him innocent. And so when he sees a truth, he pursues it full-heartedly. He is not distracted by temptation. And again, besides his cognitive limitations, he is very successful in life. Everything good comes to him. Now, due to the repetitive nature of this psalm, that points us in the direction of focusing on the laws and of keeping commandments, of meditating on these commandments, of having this strong desire for something that they can have faith in, that they can bind their life by. This law that is separate from the laws of nature, these laws of mind and of higher thinking, these laws that exist in our world, in our reality, but require a sophisticated operating system to see them and to implement them into their world, so that when they do so, they are not only a stable species, but a species that lifts nature into a higher state of being. And so you shall have no other gods before me. For if there was a God that was before the absolute, it would be sub-absolute, and whatever it is that humanity attempts to worship will be just that. They will fail to aim at the highest. Now, why one would have such a mythology to explain their existence, I don't know. But certainly the polytheistic philosophies had many interesting stories and narratives of why the things are the way they are. Certainly primitive patterns. You shall not make yourself for yourself an idol. You shall not make for yourself an idol. And this is similar, because if you were to make an idol, then you risk attributing everything to the idol itself. And you forget that what God is much larger, much more encompassing than was found in this material object. Not only that, the idol itself becomes restricted sort of to this almost primitive or simplistic body that is given to it by man. It operates by its own interest. It is not necessarily truthful in and of itself. It doesn't exist for truth. It's something that somebody prays to for their own personal gain. Something that they wish outside of the true nature of what is. They wish to break that so that they can achieve something that they do not observe. They wish to break the laws of nature so that they may be satisfied, so that they may skip the difficult steps of maturing and of learning and of knowing. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God, in vain. Now this is an interesting one, especially these days, because you hear it all the time. And part of me questions, well, does it really mean anything if we say it all the time? If there's really nothing behind it? Or is it indeed the case that it's so easy to say because our understanding of what God is so basic and so foreign, lost, that it doesn't mean anything in and of itself. And so when we say it, we don't hear its implications any longer. It's not that the implications of it end, but exactly where God is in the consciousness of man in 2023, I have a difficulty understanding. At least in the context of the United States. He seems to be there in his heart. But it's almost as if the human being is sort of the shell of an individual. Something that can't express its true belief, even though it knows deep down what to believe in. It operates under an amoral set of laws, unspoken rules, unspoken truths, or perhaps I should say unspoken falsehoods that are propagated as truth. We are bound by corporations and their interests, by governments and their relationship to said corporations, by individuals with inferior designs that pursue wealth over true prosperity, self-gain for self-liberation. That term is problematic, as we've discussed, but instead of saying self-liberation, I could say something as simple as the enrichment of the soul, the fulfillment of one's purpose that is separate from just the pure superficiality of what we consider to be successful in the modern day. And it's not that the idea of a truly successful person as a person that has achieved stability in their life because they were true to themselves and they were true to the efforts that they placed and what they gave to society. It's not that this does not exist or is dead, but rather that it seems to compete with other sources, other drives, other purposes. And it's due to the lack of this lack of the success of the true narrative, the one in which people understand what true prosperity is, that leads to all of these inferior ways of being, inferior pursuits and desires. What is the religion of the day? What can be said of our theological scholarship? Are we not these hyper-rationalist, naturalist species that seems to place the divine in nature, rather than to believe that the divine is something that set nature into motion? And so what we attempt to do, the problems that we attempt to solve, at their final conclusion, it necessarily must make us into some sort of lethargic being, something that exists in absolute harmony with nature, but in the sense that it is subject to everything in nature, and that there is nothing about man that is above the plant. There's nothing about man that is above the animal. And so at the end of that road, I'm not entirely sure what the role of the human being is, except to be this sort of vibrating, lethargic mass that is hooked up to some alternative reality, some computer-generated alternative reality, so that we don't continue to pollute and to harm our natural environment. Or, the more extreme, we take so many people, we reduce the possible impact that humanity has on this deity by reducing its body, which means killing many people, undoing the progress that we have made in the scientific era. Now, there's no hesitation for me to deny the impact that humanity has had on the earth, for all the riches and all of the things that we have uncovered about knowledge and about understanding and about ways of knowing. These sorts of things have allowed us to manipulate our environment exceptionally. And again, I don't deny our impact, our negative impact. But we've had this impact because of our failure to place our pursuits into truths that are worthy enough to facilitate our flourishing long term. And while it may seem that we are doing quite well from a material standpoint, we are utterly impoverishing ourselves spiritually. And as a result, the products, the services that we have, the businesses that we work for, it all becomes staled, watered down. It becomes this fatigued thing, as I was saying earlier. And when we forget the absolute and we submit to something that is before God, which is again the first commandment, that we shall not have gods before him, then we will submit to something inferior. Eventually our bones will be brittle and we will be broken. Broken by the very thing that we choose to submit to, which would be nature. But I say all this as a recognition of the potential consequences of the third commandment, of breaking the third commandment, which again is, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. We must remember what God is, what God means, and also what it means to betray that name. It's all good and fun to take the meaning out of words, especially those words that are full of hate. But all words are words because they have meaning. And the continual disruption of this software that we call language, I think, can dull our minds because of the very impoverished way that we have about using our language, because the meaning of the words behind our language has become so humorous and flippant, insincere, at its worst deceptive, dishonest, misleading, untrustworthy. This is the true Tower of Babel. Among people that speak the same language at the top, if this coalesces, if this trivialness, flippantness, insincerity, if it is the thing that we take to the top, that we present at the altar, we will find ourselves severely unraveled, confused, straight down to our soul. And we won't be able to understand our neighbors, our friends, our family. We will be spun out into the wilderness. And so this is why we do not take the Lord's name in vain. The fourth commandment: remember the Sabbath, to keep it holy. Now the Sabbath was and is the day of rest. It is the day that God rested after his week of creation. Now, rest as a principle, I think, is an interesting one. So if we are to examine it holistically, we can choose any number of entry points. And so I think taking the individual example or the personal example is often simplest, just because it's so immediate to one's own experience of the world. But I'll say this of rest. Rest is something that we necessarily do. We do it every night. Anybody who works any job understands the demands that it places on the mind and on the body, and the importance, if the schedule is regularly consistent, to find oneself in a consistent schedule that involves rest. And we do so that we can recover from the day, so that we can feel rejuvenated on the next day, and that we can feel reoriented, ready to do the day again. Now, in this sense, rest is something that you participate in. Right? We fall asleep and we wake up. But rest is much more than just the sleep-wake cycle, or specifically the falling asleep and waking up, that period between. The through line, or the thread of meaning that runs through it, that is the thing that is separate from the scientific questions of sleep. What happens to the body exactly when it falls asleep, what happens to the neurons, what happens to the heart rate, blood pressure, all that sort of thing. That's a different set of questions. But from an elevated point of view, the rest that has to do with rejuvenation. Now, of course, I'm aware that you can ask this and study this question scientifically. But again, viewing rejuvenation from a phenomenological perspective, that is a perspective that we can intuit by and through our experience, I think that this rejuvenation, it can serve a much greater purpose, and often it does. And it does, I think, especially among those who are followers of a particular religious tradition. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean rest, again, apart from just the sleep-wake cycle, is what we engage in, sort of phenomenologically. We experience it for a directed purpose. Now, we may argue that sleep, it's not really a directed purpose. It's sort of a quality of the body, something that it needs, even of the mind. But in terms of all poetic and beautiful pursuits, it is entirely of a different nature, just because it's required of us. Whereas something of a rest like the Sabbath, that we have a day that that's entirely devoted to celebrating God, reorienting our being into a greater, a richer, a fuller context. And we do this by and through different modes of participation. Now, this is a very active thing, and yet we can call this rest, because in some sense it's a misnomer, because I view it as spiritual nourishing. Now, spiritual nourishing, in my mind, can be associated with sort of consumption, right? It's an active process. You can't just fulfill yourself spiritually without engaging in some difficult stuff. But more particularly, more importantly, I should say, without paying attention. And I think paying attention to the degree that is necessary to learn something that is foundationally true is generally something that is difficult. Like I said, it requires a lot of attention. It requires resources for energy as the brain processes all of this stuff. And if it's put into a practice that involves the entire body, then even better, because then we can bring that along. The thing that has all of the sensors and the ability to really help us understand our environment and how it is feeling relative to the purpose we are directing it towards. I think that's an extremely beneficial way to go about spiritual nourishment. It's sort of unfortunate that our churches and things don't really have an advanced philosophy in terms of the exercise of spirituality, meaning one moving closer to God through exercise. Now, that is neither here nor there. At this point, I have come back to this conversation after a day of rest, ironically enough, and I'd like to pick up again from where we've left off. And so when I say that this is neither here nor there, I mean that the original purpose of talking about rest and talking about the remembrance of the Sabbath day and keeping it holy, as is the fourth commandment, The importance of this lies within the broad nature of rest that we've already discussed. But to summarize, it includes both the sort of physiological rest that the body requires because of the constraints of nature, but also the more divine rest, the rest of the heavens, let's say, the rest of the soul. And unlike this physiological rest, the heavenly rest is a filling. It's a filling of one's glass. It's an enrichment. It's a commitment to transformation, the continual blooming of the flower upwards into a direction that is more elevated, more profound, more beautiful. And as we have discussed before, this takes effort. So there is this yin and yang here about this rest, because both are conditions of rest. Because if we don't have the spiritual rest, we will be subject to our, in some sense, earthly pursuits. We'll be subject to merely finding the next meal to eat, finding the next partner to inseminate, to put it in vulgar terms. Everything would be subject to the base physical desire. And if at all possible, whatever heavenly principle that we are able to hold on to in such an environment without committing ourselves to this proverbial day of rest, the Sabbath day, I think will inherently be that of an inferior divine spirit, because we are not devoting ourselves to discovering what the highest divine spirit is, the unifying spirit of all unifying, or I should say the unifying spirit of all spirits. So the fifth commandment, honor your father and your mother. In some sense, quite a straightforward commandment, something that many of us these days take for granted. But then again, who can deny the state of our culture and of our families, perhaps the institution of the family? Our divorce rates are through the roof. The number of our youths that are engaging in criminal behavior, but not just criminal behavior, but behavior that is antagonistic to a meaningful and fulfilled life, and the lack of correction by parents or adults who should know better, I think is not only apparent, but it's also astounding at the speed at which this transformation has taken place in our society, but also the state that we find ourselves in. I think a lot of this has to do with this betrayal of the fifth commandment, which is not honoring your father and not honoring your mother. Now the father and the mother, the two of them, they have the authority, they have the power to conceive of something, to conceive of a human being, to conceive of the very mechanism by which this earthly reality can transcend itself in some sense. That's not to say that the human being can transcend the nature that it finds himself in, but rather that the human being can transform the earth by bringing something outside of the natural way of things to it. Now again, it doesn't mean to transform itself, because in order to transform itself, it would have to move completely outside of itself. And that just doesn't make any sense. It's not possible. It has the ability to conceive of something that is outside of itself, that created it, but itself cannot be the creator of itself. But we can, in small part, sort of mimic this process. We can create, again, the very mechanism, the machinery possible that is capable of discerning the divine law. And in performing such an act of creation, I think this is one of the most profound gifts that humanity has. One of the most useful tools within our tool belt. To create something in our image and to move it into the future, to give it what we have learned, to make it understand where we have misstepped so that they may not make the same mistakes, to give them the opportunity at something that is greater than what we have had. Now, of course, this is a certain way of viewing, and I know that even the most degenerate of human beings are still human beings at the end of it. And although their minds may be polluted by drugs that constantly pull their attention away, they draw it inwards to the satisfaction of the self. There is, I think, in most cases, barring the most extreme of psychopathologies, there is the way forward, even for these people. They can find themselves in a state of mind that leads to the appreciation of the gifts that they have been given, the responsibility that they have decided to participate in with another human being. And when it's done right, I think it can grow the tree is sort of an overused example, but it's really hard to find a better example of planting something and having a tree grow, a big strong tree grow in time, and have it bear fruits so that it can provide for other animals, for other organisms, for living beings. If I am truly to be this sojourner, this wanderer upon the earth, as the psalm goes, if my soul is consumed with longing for your rules at all times, referring to God, then certainly I would find myself in a position of asking the questions, once the generations have passed, in which the sheer depravity has deprived my higher sensibilities of any form of nourishment, and I have, through repeated experience, through repeated generations, relived the horror of placing value into lower pursuits, into inferior goods, inferior qualities, then the questions will naturally flood in. It's like a valve that was once at extremely high pressure is now released. And now this sort of cavernous body is hungry for something to fill it, to consume it, and given the experience, given the foundational question of, hang on a minute, I think we have made a mistake here. I think there's more to life than what we have been thus far engaging in. The questions, the painful questions. How am I to raise this child? How am I to raise them in such a way that they can identify what fulfills them, and they aren't so blind that they are so quick to move out into the world that they don't see the abyss that's in front of their feet, and without careful consideration they slip right into it, and they find themselves in the middle of a hurricane, confused, disoriented, one of the contemporary outlets for which perhaps this is not contemporary whatsoever. This is sort of an outlet that has existed, I'm sure, since the dawn of the conscious man and before. That when one finds himself within this hurricane, within this wilderness, this sea of confusion, the abyss, this Sheol, this pit of darkness, that they wish that they had something to simply and easily orient their attention. So they find something easy. They find heroin. They find simple pursuits. They find things that don't take effort in order to achieve satisfaction. And so how can I, as this proverbial parent, prevent this child from falling into such a state of confusion that produces all of the pathologies that many civilizations have experienced in their times of trouble and stress? This profound anxiety and this meaninglessness. The uncertainty of life itself is worth living. And so I think it's this sort of way, this reason, this is one of many, I should say, that a child should honor their father and their mother because of the commitment that they've made to one another. Now, of course, a child can be conceived through one of these, an act of a base desire that might not be rooted in love. The families might not be on board. There may not be families behind the two parties that are engaging in this intercourse. And certainly in that sense, that is not a fertile environment to produce a child, especially if the parents can barely provide for themselves and they're not even interested in each other. And so one person from that engagement is responsible for raising that child. A sort of a child that's a bastard, a child that never had a chance? How are you to plant the seed of this proverbial tree in the desert? And what of the commandment now? Should we still say that we should honor our father and our mother? And of course the answer is yes. But not just because we are commanded to do so. We are commanded to do so, but also, I think in a more subtler sense, if we are commanded to do something, if we are truly to be those that are after God, we are after the truth. And so there must be, within a commandment, within a divine law, a truth that is there waiting for us, that satisfies the most unfortunate of circumstances, the questions that spring out of and from unfortunate circumstances, like the one we have just mentioned, like the bastard child, like the bastard parents. And so from our example, in the absence of love, life, human life, has sprung forth. Now this is not truly the absence of love, because there is God's steadfast love that exists independently of man's experience. It exists independently of the behavior of his parents. But just as God is our Father, and just as the world that we find ourselves in, the natural world, is indifferent to the immediate experience of man. Now we can make many different arguments about the potentialities of love woven into the very fabric of reality. I think there's good argument for that. But then that implies an understanding of reality. And if we just consider nature, our earthly reality, the thing that some may call the objective reality, the thing that is the playground for scientific exploration and scientific questioning. If it is to be the case that this is but part of our reality, then I would say that this part, it is possible that this part is indifferent. And so when this child finds himself or herself at a point where they're coming to, with whatever degree of attention, whatever deep inside of them calls forth the question of why did my parents do this? Why did they bring me into this world? Why did they give me this life? And let's say they understood the circumstances by which their seed was sown. And the question evolves from why to how could they? How dare they? But herein lies one of many traps, I believe, within the human mind. It is something that ensnares the mind from achieving a higher sense of satisfaction and of purpose, rather than understanding the circumstances for what they are in this state of nature. We attributed to it a form of a negative mythos, that my existence, the narrative of my existence, is purely negative. Now, of course, if one is to live their lives by a profoundly negative narrative, only negative things will come of that. Now, one may spend many days within these negative questions, but at the bottom of it, I believe they'll find themselves within a small pocket that they've carved out within their conscious mind that is entirely circular. There's no way through it. There's no way out of it. You're just stuck within it. This all-consuming victimization. The all-consuming quest for vengeance. The belief that the way out of this cavern and this existential prison is not to exit through the way in which they came, but rather through pure hate and again vengeance. And the desire for the vindication of the self, that they would rather punch a hole into something false. They wish to create a reality for themselves built upon a fiction. And this fiction is that the self, that their experience, deserves something that nature itself, or rather nature alone, could not give them. And if all they can see is nature, then they will deceive themselves into thinking that nature is the entirety of their reality. And instead of exploring the room, understanding that the questions are perfectly reasonable to ask, and looking at the space, and considering it, reliving the memories, perhaps as one revisits a home in which they grew up, remembering what the furniture used to look like, remembering the good times and the bad times, asking why this or that occurred. The only way to answer that question, and the questions of a more stern nature, perhaps the ones that tug at the strings of the heart, straight down to the fundament of the soul, those of an existential nature, those of the nature of life. The only way to find those answers is to move outside of that cavern, outside of the belief in solely the harshness of nature, and find a broader context, and find the divine law, the law that surely is infused with love. And just as God is our Father at the origin of all things human and all things full stop, this love flows down through all of it. It is infused in the life of man itself, I believe. And so regardless of the material circumstances in which one finds themselves to be born into, this love is still there to be had. Now, of course, it is much better to be brought up in an environment that is rich, that is full of love on the part of the parents, that facilitates this divine love down into the heart and the soul of their children. It does not mean that those who are absent this experience cannot achieve it, nor is it the case that they are unable to provide this for their own children. A much more difficult path to walk, no doubt, to find what they never had, but certainly possible. But it's for this reason that regardless of our material circumstance, that one must honor their father and their mother, if nothing else but for the life that was given to us, for the opportunity that we've been given. Now, I perfectly understand that given as the potential negative experiences rise from the consequences of the sins of the father and of the sins of the mother, it is much more difficult to accept love. It's much more difficult to accept God, that this is even possible, to find yourself in such a state of mind that allows not only the self to love itself, but also to allow others to love itself. Commandment number 6. You shall not murder. Verse 73. Your hands have made and fashioned me. Give me understanding that I may learn your commandments. Verse 80. May my heart be blameless in your statutes, that I may not be put to shame. And so I mention those just sort of to reorient the mind here. After some potentially heavy talk, we move into another heavy commandment. You shall not murder. Why? Why shall I not murder? Shall I not murder in every case? Surely there must be a justification for murder. What if my life is in danger? Shall I not murder then? What if I need to protect somebody that I love? Shall I not murder then? Perhaps we don't call this murder. But then what do we call murder? May we define it as the taking of the life of another human being without just cause or lawful justification. But therein lies a new set of questions. What is just cause or lawful justification? And how do we know for certain if we are to be within the arms of justice when we have taken the life of another? Certainly, it's a true statement to be said that all human life is sacred. And so what does the human mind appeal to in the absence of clarification? There's no subheading to the commandment that you shall not murder. It says you shall not murder. Another potential interpretation is that thou shalt not kill. But we can raise the question, was it not the action of God that caused the death and destruction of many in the days of Noah? And so if this is to be the case, what can be said of this commandment? Are we to say this commandment is nothing in the face of contradiction? Or should we have some more sophisticated understanding in the face of the history of man? But if we are to do so and use this sort of empirical approach based on prior evidence, the available information passed down to us by our forefathers in the form of this history, we run into the same problem. We run into either the law is absolute or it's conditional. But one thing I know for certain is that human life is sacred because of the very fact that it has this conscious apparatus attached to it. The machinery that's capable of communicating with the divine spirit. That is, the ability to ascertain its laws and to implement the higher principle into the lower order, the order of the undirected, perhaps, or directed into the randomness. Directed in the sense that it is directed by the laws of nature, which are under the design of the divine, but in their nature, although they may carry a footprint of this divine origin, they cease to regularly hold the divine influence. And that's not to say that it is impossible for it to hold it, but rather it is given the power to operate independent of a continual operating force that is outside of it. Its laws are self-sufficient. The order, to whatever degree that there is within the universe, can sustain itself by its laws. Now, whether or not it can truly sustain itself, given the infinite nature of time, I don't know. There are many who seem to think that it is not possible, but that's neither here nor there. You shall not murder. What could be said of the good? What could be said of the direction? The pieces that are set in motion by the action of killing another person. If I am to do so, not only do I have to live with the burden of understanding and of knowing that I've taken a life of something that is precious, but in the more primitive sense, in the sense of man that doesn't have the acuity or the sharpness of ethical standard to really appreciate the life of another human being, then what potential consequences could there be? certainly in the short term, killing one for their own material gain, to gain their resources, perhaps out of jealousy or out of want. This immediately improves their material condition. After killing them, now they have their food, they have their land, they have their wealth. However, they do risk stability in the long run. But again, it depends on the context. If two people are to meet out in the wilderness, one is to kill another and one is to remain there the rest of his life, then what burdens does he suffer? Especially if we consider this person to be in a primitive state of mind. And this primitive state of mind, by the way, I think can exist at any period of our existence. But all of these scenarios don't really seem to be all that efficient in terms of answering the question of, is the commandment, "You shall not murder," absolute? And I come back to this question because in our culture, in the United States, even in 2023, we understand that there are special circumstances for which an individual can take the life of another. One example of that is in the example of self-defense. Another is in defense of a third party. But we can argue that just because the secular law states that we may do so, it says nothing of the divine law. And this divine law, as we have talked about, is in many ways separate from the secular law. There are areas of overlap, no doubt. But even this consideration is insufficient to answer the question, because we are left again with the divine law and the statement that we have in the text. We can also make the argument that perhaps it is the fault of the human being that wrote down a divine principle that was inspired by the divine, and yet it was incomplete. And in its incompleteness, it has a degree of falsity to it. Now, I believe that there are many strands of thought that have explored this way of thinking about the biblical text in terms of the perspective of the individual that's writing it. And I think that it can lead to some interesting thought experiments, but it also can lead to some profound negative consequences. The destabilization of the very structure that holds up any sort of order at all within the narrative. And so that continues to be a dilemma, because we cannot choose this path either. So let's recap. The circumstantial and the absolute provides us with no reason. It provides us with no answers. Because the circumstantial can fit well within an ethical framework, just as the absolute, "You shall not commit murder," both have their negative consequences to them. All the specific intricate details of which we do not need to go into. For if we did, we could spend hours upon hours upon hours of doing so. Just the mere fact of recognizing that there are pros and cons to each approach, I think, is sufficient for now. So we have the absolute and the conditional. We have the perspective, that is, the perspective of the author that wrote the Ten Commandments. The perspective of Moses could be partial, It can be incomplete. It can be utterly wrong. And yet this is still unfruitful territory, because we can explore perspectives all day long, and yet never at one time will we be able to shine a light on the entirety of the object, because always we will be viewing the object from one angle. And so we have to understand that our viewing is limited, and we cannot take the approach at this sort of infinite regress into the perspective. That's not to say that the perspective is not important, because it can offer new insights that we did not know before. But in terms of identifying the whole of something all at once, I think the perspective is insufficient. So if we are to sort of take the Vervaekean approach, to use that language, the 4 P's of knowing, the participatory, the perspectival, the procedural, the propositional, what we can say is that in terms of answering this question, it cannot be merely perspective-based. It cannot be merely propositional. We cannot merely give an endless number of examples in different scenarios, because at a certain point it's just unproductive. What can we say of the participatory and the procedural? What would it mean to have a participatory component of knowing that one shall not commit murder, or that one should not kill? Well, in order to participate in that commandment, it's just not doing it. So in this sense, it's pretty straightforward. We follow the commandment as it is written. That still does not answer our questions. It still does not satisfy us. We don't know how to reconcile what is perfectly reasonable to defend oneself, to save one's life, in the face of another that is evil. And we also cannot reconcile the fact that if we are to recognize life as sacred, and that we should not kill another because one is sacred, then we may, in that situation of self-defense, forfeit our own lives for the gain of another, for the short-term gain of another. And in the grand scheme of things, it seems as though our life was pointless. However, I think that may be a very self-centered way of viewing and of seeing. But rather, I will admit that I have no good answers to this dilemma, but I would say that if we are to take the principle that the human being is sacred, and that murder shall not be committed full stop, it does not mean that one who commits murders should not be prevented from doing so. Certainly if one is to commit a murder within a body of people, that individual can be prevented from participating in that body of people. They can be exiled, they can be put in confinement, and so forth and so on. But I think the main point here is that the ultimate judgment has to come from God. And just as is the case, that we have decided collectively in the West, the United States in particular, to remove the arbitrary nature, to separate the church from our state, to remove the arbitrary nature of authority and of hereditary succession, and place the power and the rule of the state into the hands of the people, that they can be represented by a body or by individuals that are among their own body. And so we do this because we recognize that there are certain powers that man cannot hold. Because it is entirely possible that the powers that truly belong to the divine, when placed in the hands of man, may pervert the very idea of the divine power, and it can be used for the purposes of the individual in power. But again, therein lies the dilemma. If there is truly a divine being, then should we not be governed more strictly? Should we not notice this law more immediately? And of course, we fall back and we say there is no good reason for that to be the case. This may be a selfish approach to understanding the nature of the divine and the behavior of the divine. All very dissatisfactory, I must say. So let's return to the question then. Why shall one not murder? Ultimately, I do think it has to do with the ultimate judgment for the life of man residing in the hand of God. However, and I think this is a big however, there are no shortage of examples in the Old Testament, even in the Psalms, especially in the Psalms, of the authors of these poems writing essentially to God, praying and singing to God, so that He can be with them, so that they may conquer their enemies. And we understand in this case, in many cases I should say, that conquering one's enemy, either by conquest or by defense, will require the killing of human beings. And so, rather than get lost in a never-ending argument, never-ending ethical argument, I think, again, we can say that ultimately the true righteous judgment comes from God. But we cannot execute that judgment. We are unable to do so. And we may be commanded not to kill and not to murder. However, we are fallen beings. But just because we are fallen does not mean that it is an excuse. But we have yet to reach the point where the enlightenment of the human mind, I think, can fully understand the reason why one shall not kill. Full stop. Verse 172. My tongue will sing of your word, for all your commandments are right. Let your hand be ready to help me, for I have chosen your precepts. So commandment number 7, you shall not commit adultery. Now, I think this one is fairly straightforward. The importance of marriage and of that type of union and of that the creation of the fertile space that is to be the foundation of a family is the foundation of the society. It is the maintenance of the collective. It is also the maintenance of the individual, in a certain sense. In the sense that once one has a family, they have created a new mind, in a certain sense. They've created a new level of intelligibility. Now, it doesn't mean that this will necessarily improve their condition spiritually, but just as the mind of man gives him an advantage compared to his animal counterparts, the family gives the individual a sort of a mind upon the mind, a mechanism upon the mechanism, through which he or she can receive the divine wisdom. And this is in part, but not restricted to, the participation that one engages in when they have a family, and the love that one feels, almost naturally, perhaps naturally, for their spouse and for their children. And so if one is to commit adultery, one is to inherently betray that trust and that mechanism by which the divine principle is amplified and can come in to the individual and to this new level of the family. And of course it scales all the way up to the body of the nation. Commandment number 8, you shall not steal. There are many, as we have discussed before, there are many avenues, I think, to open up a sort of a portal into understanding. This is the perspectival approach. What's important is that we find one perspective and then we open it and then we move into it, and that we don't just keep on bouncing forth between different perspectives. So in terms of you shall not steal, I will take the internal example. That is, the potential consequences that stealing can have on the formation of the individual and the relationship of this individual to not only other individuals, but also the divine. So first, if one is to steal, one is to take something that does not belong to them. Now, this concept of belonging, I think, is quite interesting. Because what does it exactly mean for something to belong to me? If something does not belong to somebody, and then I walk along and I claim it, and now it belongs to me, what sin is there if someone else comes along, looks at that same thing, and takes it from me? It steals my belonging. I think there's something deeper here, because I think it's often difficult to see profound truths through trivial examples. And that was a very trivial example. But the last statement, I don't think, is a trivial statement. If somebody else is to steal one's belonging, now what does that mean? For somebody to have belonging, I think, in a sense, it is a tethering to reality. I can say the objective reality, but I really don't want to say that. It is correct in a certain sense. But in terms of the encompassing whole that involves the objective world, the inside world, that is everything within my mind, the subjective world, and then the highway that unites the two, the sort of transjective. If we are to take that as one thing, I think belonging is the facilitation of these three aspects. It is the unity of all three. Now, if somebody's going to steal that belonging, they are inherently stealing the tethering that I have to reality, and they are robbing my attention. And in so doing, they are taking me away from this practice of, let's say, divine recognition. That is to say, that in order for one to be in harmony and to be within this state of belonging, they are inherently engaged in an act, I think, of truthfulness. Because the subject is seeing through their lens to the reality, and it's mapping perfectly through this. It can be an object, this thing that belongs to the individual. And in such a case, even in the most trivial of examples, that if I have something that is of value to me, and it scales, of course, like many things do, down to the most trivial to the most expensive, they all have their effects. Some may not be as salient as others, but as we move towards the higher end of this salience landscape, if someone was to steal something from me that was very valuable, like the life of a loved one, let's say, or my vehicle, right? My car, something that I use that's extremely important to maintain my life. Then I think we are thrown into a state of distress. We are thrown into a state of confusion, of instability. And this confusion and instability, as we have talked about many times before, can be a mechanism by which the divine wishes to communicate with us, if it is directed in such a manner. If it is not, if it is the cause of man or the cause of nature, it is dangerous. And what we, as human beings, require and move towards is a balance between this uncertainty and wild nature. We keep it at the fringes, but at its core, we have stability, we have culture, we have civilization. We have the things that ground us to this reality. We do need a bit of the wilderness to keep us honest, because if we become over strict, if we become overly stable, we can run the risk of the very foundations, or not recognizing when our foundations have shifted under our feet. And so there's always this recognition between what is most stable and the chaotic, dangerous forces that lurk at the edge of town. And so I think that, again, since we're following this perspective, and we'll keep it that way so we can understand this, rather than jump ship to another one, and we remain in this sort of individual sphere. If I could say in summary, one shall not steal Because the consequences of stealing from another are the introduction of the chaotic principle of nature into the mind of man, and the drawing of the attention away from the heavenly principles towards the more inferior, that of vengeance, and that of, again, this sort of confused state, this separation of the attention in multiple different directions, so it is no longer oriented in a way that the individual can move the totality of himself, his being, in a particular direction. Now, it doesn't guarantee, of course, that the individual was moving in the right direction to begin with, and perhaps what was stolen from the individual could wake the person up to recognize the error of their ways, but it still is a net negative, I think, this stealing. And if it is the case that one is to have a transformative experience, a sort of self-correction because of the absence of something that was very valuable to them, this is likely the influence of the divine wilderness. So I'm hoping that makes some sense. Commandment number 9. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. What is a neighbor? A neighbor in the modern day is somebody that we live close to. Our homes are close to their homes. A neighbor, more broadly, or more importantly, I think is somebody that exists close to us, that does not penetrate our inner circle, that we could say, of the family. And so this neighbor, this person of the community that perhaps we trust, that we share meals with. These people we form bonds with. Of course, there are weaker bonds than the bonds that we form within our own families, but they are bonds of love nonetheless. And to bear false witness against your neighbor is to introduce this disorderly, confused, insecure confusion into the collective, into the body of man, into the neighborhood, into the town, into the city, into the state, into the nation, whatever. Because all of these levels have neighbors. An individual has a neighbor, a town has a neighboring town, a city has a neighboring city, a state has a neighboring state, a nation has a neighboring nation, etc. And to bear false witness against him is to say some falsehood for one's own personal gain, or to see them put to an inferior position. And again, just much like commandment number 6, you shall not murder, or you shall not kill, it is not necessarily because false witness may not be good for the overall collective. We can find any number of niche circumstances that support a particular position. But the general principle is that the truth of the matter is what is paramount, because the truth is of God. And so, if we are to bear false witness, we are to bear a false faith in God. We are to move away from Him for some purpose other than that of God's will and God's direction, let's say. And I think this has a number of consequences, not only at the level of the individual, but of course at the level of the stability of the collective, of the body of people. Commandment number 10, you shall not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. I think this is similar, but instead of introducing this instability, well, I think it actually is very similar. It is another form of instability, of confusion, that's introduced into the system. And I should add that it is the sort of man-made hurricane that's introduced here. That man-made destructive force that attempts to break the bonds of neighbors. Because if one is to covet something that belongs to our neighbor, we are to, in some sense, be jealous of what they have and what they've achieved. We feel like they aren't worthy of what they have. We try to inflate our own ego and compare ourselves to another and say that what we have done is of higher standards and therefore we deserve to receive more. But of course this is pride, this is the ego, this is self-inflation. What one should do is to focus on their own path and their own journey. What comes to another is the result of their multitude of circumstances within that individual's life that we ourselves cannot control, that had led them to a particular state of belonging, or having a certain set of belongings. So it is out of our control. Secondly, I think they're hidden in here somewhere, is the instruction not to get lost in materialism. Because when I think of not coveting the belongings of a neighbor, I think of, what this person has in a material sense that I don't have. Of course, it could extend to something that is a little bit more profound, like love and a family and this sort of thing. I think both equally apply. We build our virtue not upon the jealousy of the achievements of others, but by the true and honest work of the achievement of our own efforts. So this is quite the long episode. And so I think I'm going to stop it here. I'm going to pick it up next time with Psalm 120, Deliver me, O Lord.